So Jesus is actually speaking about himself, first of all, in this famous image of the grain of wheat falling to the ground and dying. And in fact, there are so many images, so many examples from nature of, passing through, a death, so that greater life can result. The caterpillar and the butterfly, for example, or any time you see a seed, buried and then something new growing out of it, unsuspected and almost unlimited, unimagined fruitfulness. But that's what we need to do. So nature teaches us it's not something that has to be revealed. It's something that's right in front of us all the time. And Jesus just confirms it by his own life and his own teaching. So the grain of wheat must fall into the dark, and that's what it feels like, usually, into some dark place. And if it doesn't do that, it remains alone. And that's the thing. We see ourselves as separate, and our mind becomes calculating and defensive, kind of like the evolutionary thing, eat or be eaten. All right, I got to preserve my life. I got to make sure I survive. I got to get ahead, and I got to defend myself against everybody else, all the different races and religions and nationalities and all these other people that are a threat, the immigrants, whatever it might be. And so you remain alone. You don't die. You love your life, and so in the end you lose it. Literally, you destroy it, because we're made for so much more than that, as Jesus' Paschal mystery shows. So it's a tragedy if we remain all defensive and solitary and isolated, merely trying to preserve our own life. Whereas Jesus says if you lose your life, if you fall down into the ground and die, then you will keep your life, keep it for eternal life, or bear much fruit, which is what Jesus did. The grain of wheat, which became, the Eucharist, became the risen Christ, flourishing for all ages. You've got to die first. So we somehow have to get out of our minds, which are so calculating and so isolating and so incapable of going to any depth. That's why the Christian tradition says, prayer is bringing the mind down into the heart. You can live from the heart. That's why, the image, for example, of the Sacred Heart, it's not the sacred mind, right? It's the Sacred Heart. That's the center of the person from which we really connect. You can't be isolated, really, if you live on the level of the heart, because the heart is meant for connection. It's got a warmth and a softness to it, which the mind doesn't have. And it's meant for connecting to everything and everyone, including God. So that's why the first reading is so important from Jeremiah, where he says, I'm not going to make a covenant with you. I'm going to make a new covenant, not like the old one, which was a book, a tablet full of laws, that your mind can examine. But I'm going to write my law on your heart. That's what it says. I'm going to put my law within you, so you'll know from the heart. And he says you won't need anybody to teach you the laws, because you'll have the law written on your heart. He says everybody will know me. Nobody will have to teach you, because you'll have it already in you. Conscience, it's the inspiration of the Spirit. You'll have the Lord within you. So they'll know me from the least to the greatest, it says. Not all churchmen like to hear that, because they want to be the teachers, No, you know what's the right. You know what the Lord is asking, because it's written already in your heart. And that's the great privilege, that we have. Our heart is already full of God's light and love. And of course, then God's action, that's where the psalm comes in today, this famous Psalm 51. Let your heart be softened, God says in Ezekiel, I'm going to take out the heart of stone from your breast, and I'm going to give you natural hearts of flesh, hearts that can feel. And that's dangerous, right? Because then you have compassion and connection and suffering and the risks of love and all of that stuff. We'd rather, protect ourselves, and keep our life safe. No, but you're going to love in the very dimensions of Christ himself. So create for me a clean heart, oh God, as we just sang. Or other, it says also there, a willing spirit, a firm spirit, one that is truly open to soften our heart. And we'll suffer. But that will hopefully soften our heart, and it won't harden our hearts, won't turn us bitter. It didn't turn Jesus bitter, but it made his heart more forgiving. Father, forgive them. They know not what they're doing, which is true all the time in our own lives as well, if we're honest, whether we're doing it or it's being done to us. So that's where the second reading comes in, this very famous passage about Jesus' own suffering and how he learned from it. That's what it says. He learned obedience from what he suffered. He said in the days of his flesh, and we don't usually picture Jesus this way, but I'm sure it's accurate, he says, with loud cries and tears, he offered his prayers and supplications to the Lord and to God, to the Father, and he was heard because of his reverence. So if we find ourselves in these times or whatever times with loud cries and tears, our heart bursting and breaking, well, join the club. That's what it means to be human. That's what Jesus shows us is the way. And that will open our hearts. He learned from what he suffered. Interesting. And again, we don't need revelation for this. Of course, it's great to have the example of Jesus, but it's everybody's fate and destiny. I often point out that the author of the letter to the Hebrews, which certainly wasn't Paul, was the most cultured Greek writer, very clear from his style. And that phrase, learned by suffering, he got from the playwright Aeschylus in the ancient Greek culture. One of his main themes was you learn by suffering. So he borrowed that from Aeschylus to indicate what Jesus went through. You learn by suffering. You learn the dimensions of humanity. You learn the dimensions of God's love by the suffering and the compassion and the openness and what you suffer through your openness. But that's the path that Jesus showed. And as he says, whoever wants to serve me will follow me where I am, there will my servant be. So we've got to follow that same path. It's just the path of humanity anyway. You can't escape it. If you try, you'll just make your life more miserable. You'll lose your life anyway. And so he concludes by saying, when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. In other words, when I am lifted up on the cross between heaven and earth, and my arms outstretched to embrace the whole of creation, when I take on all the sin and suffering of the world, as I started to do already in my public life, then all will be drawn to me. I'll draw all to me, because my heart, about to be pierced, will be open to the whole universe. And I will draw all people there with me and to me. And where I am, there shall my servant be. So are we ready for that? Are we ready to extend our hands and have our heart pierced and broken, to extend our heart and our hands to the whole universe, to the whole world, everyone's suffering, everyone's weakness, everyone's sin, with loud cries and tears, and to learn from that suffering the dimensions of God's love and the dimensions of the love we're called to ourselves? I will draw all to myself. So maybe that's why people don't really want to explore the spiritual life, because you got to die and have your heart broken and your whole heart opened up to all the suffering, not just your suffering, your little isolated suffering that you try to protect yourself from in vain, but the suffering of all. And that's what heals you. That leads to resurrection, almost paradoxically. because that's God's love coursing through you, and God's love is eternal and powerful and goes beyond death, has power beyond death, as it did in Jesus' resurrection. So let's share not only Jesus' passion, or yes, share fully Jesus' passion now, which is the passion of everyone, everywhere, always, and our own, which is everyone's, everywhere, always, and Christ's. Don't be afraid to die and rise, to open your heart to that full dimension of what it means to be human and what it means to be divine.